Люди, знімаю це відео, аби потім дивились і знали, як воно було. Ми під Константинівкою, блядь. Орки давять так, що не встигаємо вивозити.
Russian troops began moving forward at their fastest rate in a year in May. The New York Times reported the beginning of the Russian armed forces offensive in Ukraine, citing analysts. Western analysts believe Russia could use the dry season, which is considered the most favorable for offensive operations, to strengthen its negotiating position.
Таке. Що ми, люди, робимо, я не знаю, блядь.
They noted that it would be rational for Russia, which has an advantage on the battlefield, to use military pressure as leverage in any negotiations. Earlier, the Spiegel reported that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had decided to end his visit to Germany early and return to Ukraine because Russia was allegedly advancing in the Sumy region. According to the newspaper, the Ukrainian leader was supposed to attend the presentation of the International Charlemagne Prize to the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, but changed his plans after information emerged that Russian troops were continuing their offensive in the Sumy region. Meanwhile, in Ukraine's east, the Donbas front lines continue to shift as Russian forces intensify pressure on a wide front along the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka axis, employing a methodical strategy of logistical isolation rather than direct frontal assaults. Following the successful encirclement tactics seen in previous strategic battles for the cities, Russian troops are now applying similar pressure to Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk, systematically severing Ukrainian supply routes and weakening defensive cohesion. The BBC Russian service reported on the 22nd of May that over the past weeks, the situation around the city of Konstantinovka in the northern Donetsk region has become much more complicated. The Russian army managed to break through Ukrainian defenses to the west of the city and began to implement a plan to encircle it. Konstantinovka, they say, is part of a larger agglomeration that also includes Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, and Chasiv Yar. This industrial and administrative center of the Ukraine-controlled part of the Donbas was a target of the Russian offensive in the first months of the invasion. At that time, the Russians tried to enter here from the north through Liman and Izium, but these plans were ruined by the Kharkiv Ukrainian counteroffensive in the fall of 2022. Now the Russians are slowly fighting their way to the agglomeration from the south, west, and the east. Daily reports from the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine show that it is here, on the border of the Pokrovsk, Donetsk, and Kramatorsk directions, that most of the fighting has been taking place in recent weeks. As of the end of May, the Russian army has almost reached the last major obstacle on its way, the Kleban-Vik Reservoir. A few kilometers away from it, the outskirts of Konstantinovka begin, and the main goal of the Kremlin's summer military campaign may be the capture of the city. So my friends, a lot has happened over the past 8 days or so since I made my last video. Russia continues to focus on cutting the logistics roads around Pokrovsk and attempting to isolate the key town of Konstantinovka, which is the first of 4 cities that comprise the last defensive belt for the Ukrainian armed forces in the Donbas. So I will cover these 2 directions in today's update. Stick around to the end screen to see some bonus footage and watch the membership trailer video in the end screen, which gives you information on all the perks that you will get if you join the channel membership. Also check out the merch store to get yourself some whips, merchandise. Links for all these sites are in the description. So let's get into it. The recent Russian victory in Nova Poltavka marks a critical development in the ongoing offensive. Located between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, this settlement's fall completely disrupts one of Ukraine's key supply arteries. Russian forces, spearheaded by the 57th Motorized Rifle Regiment, secured the village after a multi-day push. first securing outlying positions near Shevchenko Kryche to the west on May 17th. They broke into the southern outskirts and raised the Russian flag in the center by May 18th. On May 19th, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation officially declared another important victory in the area. The village of Nova Poltavka, located northeast near the same strategic road, came under the full Russian control. Last week, Russian flags were also raised in the village of Malinovka, located southwest on the same road, with Nova Poltavka, Nova Poltavka, and Malinovka under their full control. Russian troops are now rapidly advancing toward Poltavka and Chasiv Yar, threatening to cut the remaining paved road linking Pokrovsk to Chasiv Yar and Kramatorsk. If this route is severed, Ukrainian forces will be forced to rely on secondary roads to the west through Dobropila, further straining an already precarious logistical network. The new Novo-Olenovsky flower is blooming, which means Russian advance is underway in several directions in the area of these settlements along the road between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. A similar flower tactics effectively bloomed in the area of the strategically important logistics hub of Ocheretino, which allowed the liberation of vast territories in the Donbas. In 1 week, the Russian forces occupied more than 50 square kilometers on the Konstantinovka front. This is the fastest advance since the beginning of the year. And worst of all, they managed to ensure a fairly low level of their losses per 1 square kilometer. Thus, in this area, Ukrainian armed forces eliminated 88 Russians in May, although on average, on the front in previous months, 130, and in March to April, it is alleged more than 200. The Russians have already occupied 12 kilometers of the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka highway and continue to break through north from Novo-Alexandrovka to Yablonivka, where the Ukrainian armed forces will try to stabilize the front. 15 kilometers remain to the outskirts of Konstantinovka, despite the fact that the defense forces managed to hold part of Malinivka and not allow the Russians to continue the offensive on Myrnograd. Although the Russians advanced in the direction of Muryo-Gulivka and began to seize territory around Yelisavetovka, where the Ukrainian defenders found themselves in a semi-encirclement and therefore will soon leave these positions. At the same time, the Russians significantly expanded the zone of their control to the west and north of Nova Poltavka, in the direction of the recently evacuated villages of Chasiv Yar. In fact, Russia continues to deepen into Ukrainian territory and creates an opportunity for itself to enter the rear of Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. It needs this primarily to cut off logistical arteries and therefore to prepare a full-fledged siege. Although the Russians will not be able to attack 2 cities at the same time, they will have to choose where the situation will be more favorable to them. At the same time, the Russians had made minor advances on Konstantinovka from the direction of Avdiivka and Donetsk. In particular, the Russians managed to gain a foothold in part of the village of Romanivka. In the event of a complete liberation, this will allow the Russian armed forces to continue moving north and enter the flank of the Ukrainian defenders in Chervenivka and Donetsk. From the other flank, the Russians advanced 1 kilometer east of Donetsk in the area of the village of Dachny. Now, as a railway and a road junction, Konstantinovka plays an important role as a logistics hub and fortified area for the armed forces of Ukraine. Since the first weeks of the 2022 invasion, it has repeatedly found itself under attack from Russian aircraft and long-range missiles. As the front approached in the spring, the outskirts of the city found themselves within the range of Russian FPV drones and artillery. In early May, the press service of the 93rd Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces wrote that Russian fiber optic drones were already attacking military and civilian transport directly in Konstantinovka. In quotations, enemy operators resort to a cunning tactic. They land drones on roads and wait for the equipment or vehicles to move along them. Then they raise the drone and shoot down or destroy the transport, the brigade explained. The authorities say that 20 to 30% of the houses in Konstantinovka have already been destroyed, but there are still up to 9,000 civilians in the city, before the war, about 70,000 lived there. The children have all been taken away, says the head of the local military administration, Sergei Gorbanov. In 2023 to 2024, Konstantinovka was considered a relatively rare city. The front was 30 to 40 kilometers from here. This allowed the city to be used as a base for the deployment of weapons and logistics for Ukrainian groups that fought in the Bakhmut and Donetsk directions. However, last spring, Russian troops launched an offensive from Bakhmut in the direction of Chasiv Yar, the main height and the last bastion of defense on the eastern flank of Konstantinovka. Despite the fact that the Russians were unable to quickly capture the city of Chasiv Yar, they are gradually gnawing through the Ukrainian defense and have already approached the western outskirts of Chasiv Yar. From here to the urban development of Konstantinovka is just about a mere 10 kilometers. In June of last year, the Russian army launched an offensive on the southern flank attacking Donetsk. Despite the Russian Defense Ministry's statements about full control over the city, in reality, pockets of resistance to the Ukrainian armed forces still remain in the vicinity of Donetsk. This significantly slows down the movement of Russian troops, who are now trying to find a breach on the flanks of the city, near the villages of Shubinivka and Dilievka. From here to Konstantinovka, this is approximately 12 to 13 kilometers. Russian military bloggers are already calling the situation near Konstantinovka almost a strategic breakthrough for the Russian army. At least, this is what one of the popular Russian military observers, Yuri Podolyaka, thinks. In quotations, there is no longer any doubt that in this area, for the first time in this war, we have achieved a classic deep breakthrough of the enemy's defense on a strategic scale. Yes, the speed of movement is not like in the Great Patriotic War, but then there were no drones that constrain any movement of both ours and the enemy, and that do not allow us to move faster, he wrote on May 21st. According to him, the Russian army has already approached the line of the villages of Chasiv Yar, Poltavka, Rusin Yar, Stepanovka. Breaking through this line of defense will allow them to approach the key bypass road, Dobropolye, Kramatorsk, and more actively attack it, in particular with FPV drones. Accordingly, this could paralyze the logistics of the Ukrainian armed forces in this direction. Lastly, Russian media RIA Novosti reports that the strategic importance of Konstantinovka is hard to overestimate. The city, along with Druzhivka, is a key to the Slovyansk and Kramatorsk agglomeration, with a population of about 400,000 people. The loss of this territory breaks the front, leaves the flank of Chasiv Yar unprotected, and nullifies the operational link with Slovyansk. The Ukrainian armed forces understand this and therefore cling to every stronghold. The headquarters, arsenals, and rare structures of the entire Ukrainian group in Donbas are located in Kramatorsk and Slovyansk. Their loss means the defeat of the Ukrainian armed forces. The agglomeration is also approaching from the northeast. In May, the West Group liberated Toskoye, a village 18 kilometers west of Kremenaya and 10 kilometers east of Krasny Liman. A large fortified area of the Ukrainian armed forces along the Terny-Yampolivka-Toskoye line fell. From this bridgehead, an offensive on Krasny Liman, an intermediate target before Slovyansk, should be expected. The loss of Konstantinovka, Druzhivka, Kramatorsk, and Slovyansk will seriously affect the Ukrainian economy and significantly weaken Ukraine's industrial potential. These cities also have enormous symbolic significance. The liberation of Donbas began there in the spring of 2014, and it would be historically fair if it ended there in complete victory.
Чисто? Пошли! Чисто! Там что, чисто? Красава!